Hi, my name is Jayson Otto, and for the next 40 minutes or so, I'll be talking about the Fruit Ridge. The Fruit Ridge is a region that is just outside of Grand Rapids, where the elevations and the temperatures and the soil all kind of come together very nicely to be able to grow apples and other fruits. There's a long history of farming on the ridge that extends back literally thousands of years, and farmers for a long time have used different strategies to make a living up there. That's kind of why I have this on this first frame here, the picture of a silo in the middle of an orchard. As you can see, at one time there was a mixed farm here, and people were growing grains of some sort, either for their own animals or to sell. But at one time, eventually, it was decided, or someone bought the land, or something else happened where an orchard was put in around it because it was more lucrative to grow apples. And this is an older orchard here, as you can see. This is before the trellising now, with the real intensive production up on the ridge. And this talk will go all the way back to the 1830s, when this land was taken through treaties. And where indigenous people were moved off of this really valuable land where you could grow crops. And we'll go all the way to now, where we have overproduction. So where is the Fruit Ridge? The Fruit Ridge is one of the many Great Lakes fruit belts that offer ideal growing conditions for tree fruits and also for berries and other small fruits. These fruit belts in the Great Lakes here are the second most diverse agricultural regions in the country, behind California. Michigan as a state is the second most diverse, and mainly because of this swath here along Lake Michigan. There should also be a fruit belt right here. A lot of cherries are growing up in Door County. And because of Lake Michigan's effect on the peninsula, the freezes come later in the spring, and you tend to have a warmer fall, and fruits tend to do really well in much better than if you were over here or any of these other places. The climate is just much better for fruits that blossom and need to have those blossoms set before the freeze happens, before any sort of freezing happens. There are also elevation changes along here and other things that really help. There's three main regions within the fruit belt in Michigan. Up here in the northwest, you have where the cherries are grown, the most tart cherries anywhere else in the country. Down here in the southwest, in Berrien and Allegan and Van Buren, you have a lot of berries grown. You have traditionally there were a lot of peaches grown down here. Lots of grapes, especially Concord grapes for grape juice, and currently actually a decent swath of wine grapes since the 1970s. And they had that access to Chicago with steamships and then with trucks going into Chicago. And then the third really major section is the Fruit Ridge, right here. And this is what we're going to be talking about. You can see how the fruit belt kind of like kicks in a little bit right here, because there's a really unique ecology in this region. This is a really great map from 1933. That was put together by this guy, J.O. Veach, through the Michigan Agricultural College. Michigan State's map library, by the way, is a wonderful resource. And if you are interested in old maps of Michigan, this is a really great place to go. I use a good amount in this talk that I'll show in a minute. But anyways, they're really great and they're really helpful. And they love having people come in and go through their maps. So if you're interested in historical maps, really great place. This is a cool map because it assesses all of the agricultural land in Michigan. So this person went through and looked at where the conditions were good for starting a farm. And so that involved soil, that involved growing season. So in southwest Michigan down here, it has 100 more days than up here in this red section. This red section also is where the the pine cutover was, and it's mostly sandy. It's not really great soil for agriculture. You can grow potatoes, maybe sugar beets and other things up in there, but it's not really great for, without having to amend the soil greatly to grow many things. But this region we're talking about is right here, just outside of Grand Rapids, and as you can see when Veach did this map, those black dots represent, each of those dots is 2,300 acres, and you can see how there's a lot of prime agricultural land up in this region. So this region is, just northwest of Grand Rapids, west of Sparta, up in that area, and there's a lot of great agricultural land up there, a lot of valuable land. And this talk starts with another great map. This is John Farmer, who was a cartographer that did a lot of really early Michigan survey maps. Michigan is really unique as a state that has these really great early maps that are pretty accurate. And this one is from 1836, and there was a treaty signed in 1836 when the land north of the Grand River was ceded from the Odawa and the Ojibway tribes of the Anishinaabe. And this is a really valuable map to look at when thinking about the Fruit Ridge. So Grand Rapids is in this region right here. And as you can see, by 1836, this region was not surveyed, right? So they hadn't sent out the surveyors to block up everything into squares. And this hadn't been done yet up here by 1836. And this is where all that Fruit Ridge land is, right about in here. So people moving from the East Coast were very interested in getting their hands on this agricultural land, mainly to grow wheat, because wheat was worth so much at the time. But they did know that fruits grew up here, because people had been farming up here for a long time. And people continue to farm up here. And so this talk goes from the earliest white settlers, white colonists, moving into now, where there's so many farms up there still that are centennial farms, which is a real concentration of centennial farms up there, because people were able to hold on to their farms, partly because it's such great agricultural land, and at the same, and it has you're able to grow specialty crops that you can't really grow other places well, and at the same time they were able to market this really well. And I'd like to thank the Alpine Historical Society for giving me this list of the centennial farms. It's really hard to find a good list of centennial farms, but a really cool thing you can go to is at the Michigan State Archives, the State of Michigan Archives. They have all the centennial farm documents, and it's really fun to go through and read the histories that a lot of these farm families wrote about their own farms. It's a really valuable resource that could be leveraged by historians. So I just want to thank a few people before I dig deep into this. My perspective came from when I was asked to give a talk on the Fruit Ridge at Michigan State History Society at their conference a couple years back, 2 summers back. I went into the Grand Rapids Public Library and I'm like, hey, I was looking for stuff about the Ridge, and Jennifer Andrew was like, hey, wow, we just got these letters from Adelia, from this lady, Julia Collins. Julia Collins is an ancestor of Adelia Hills, and if you know anything about Alpine Township, Adelia Hills is the woman who named the township at one of the first township meetings. So she is one of the pioneer colonists that came from the East Coast to settle down in this land that had just been offered for sale. At the same time, these letters are really great because you have a perspective from a woman, and you don't always get that perspective when you're looking at history from this period. At the same time, you also get a perspective of someone from kind of an upper class, but at the same time roughing it out in the frontier, and well, not really frontier at this point, but roughing it as a colonist, and giving a perspective of the people around her. A lot of them were squatting. They were preemptors, they called them, and I'll get into that a little more. But it's really great that we have these letters. There's a lot of great description in them. I'm not going to get too deep into the description into them, but you all can go read her letters because they're bound in the Michigan room now. And these are other people that were helpful as I thought about this. I was going to write my dissertation partly about the ridge, but I've focused more on Southwest Michigan. So these are things that I picked up, as I thought about proposing a much longer project on it. So where is the fruit ridge? I mean, I showed you the map, and that is, where the ridge is now. But in Michigan, the first fruit ridge was not in Grand Rapids. The road called Fruit Ridge was not called the road until the mid-40s, as this classified says right here. Pick yourself raspberries at Don Coffey's farm on Fruit Ridge, formerly Walker Road. So at one time, Fruit Ridge was Walker Road. One thing I did find is they were planning to have a Fruit Ridge neighborhood, and this was the Fruit Ridge addition over on the west side, just south of 4th Street. It was going to have Fruit Ridge Road and Concord Place right off of Bristol right here. But if you look at what it eventually became, it became Union High School. So that never panned out, having a Fruit Ridge right there. One other thing that I think is important when looking at this map, and I didn't really notice it at first, but there's also Mrs. Sarah Smith's greenhouse up there. And Grand Rapids was a really important center for greenhouse production. The Grand Rapids lettuce is still an important commercial variety, and it was developed here. There is a lot of information in the newspapers and other documents about the greenhouses in Grand Rapids, and they were all over. Fulton Street Cemetery had, where that is now, there were greenhouses, and a lot of other places. And this is important to the fruit growers also, because the greenhouse people were hooked up with the nursery people, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Grand Rapids was really a center for horticulture. So before I go any further, I just want to quickly mention the first fruit ridge in in Michigan. As I did research, I was like, wow, this is what pops up when you look for the fruit ridge. And it's in Lenawee County. This guy, George B. Horton, who was the Grange State Master from 1892 to 1908, so for quite some time. And his wife also was the National Lady Assistant. So if you know anything about the Grange was quite egalitarian when it came to men and women, even though it tended to be quite a conservative but radical organization. And he lived in a farm called Fruit Ridge. And there at Fruit Ridge, this is a picture of his mansion there, which is actually on the National Historic Register, he started cheese factories. And he became known for the Michigan cheese. And there was a Michigan cheese fever that a lot of people in southeast Michigan got into. There was a special soft cheese they were making. People really liked it in New York and other places. And there's a great book about it called Cheese Fever that just came out based on this person's dissertation. George B. Horton is someone that really would be great to dig deeper into, because politically he was a chameleon. He supported William Jennings Bryan back during the populist movement. He ran as a Democrat. He ran as a Republican for office in Michigan, back and forth. Sometimes he would make deals across bipartisan lines. A real Granger, because the Grange did not believe in partisan politics. He was a free silver guy, which people which haunted him when he ran when he'd run as a Republican. So I'm not going to dig into this very much at all, but I just thought this would be cool to mention, because I think there's a lot here that can be dug into. There's three main ideas I want to use to explore the history of the Fruit Ridge. And the first one is Grand Rapids as a food hub. Grand Rapids has a long history, going back into oral history of a place where people brought stuff they had produced or gathered, and then redistributed it back out. And so we'll talk about that. And then the second major point is about how the ridge was settled and really resettled, because people were there and were eventually removed through either preemption or removal acts that sent people up into Oceana County and other places onto allotments. But because it was this hub, you know, people came to the rapid to start a new life. And we tend to talk about, in the history of Grand Rapids, you know, it goes from native people to furs, right? It was the next industry. And then we kind of do a big jump into industrial production of furniture. And farms don't really get as much, they're always kind of a footnote. The rural and the urban are connected. And Grand Rapids, you know, if you do look into the industry, even into the 20th century, there were just as many people dealing with wholesale marketing of fruits and vegetables, or grinding, wheat for mills and other things like that, as there were working in factories producing actual tangible, consumables. It's a type of agricultural colonization that happened around the city, which really grew the city. And then finally, the ridge was marketed really well. Even now that we call it the ridge, people just tended to call it the ridge. It became the ridge. And really the Peach Ridge Growers Association, which I'll talk about, or Peach Ridge Fruit Growers Association, were really pivotal of that in the late 20s or early 30s, and then going to now. And you know, the Fruit Ridge is an important agritourism space, and still people doing diverse things up there, which I'll mention towards the end. So first, Grand Rapids as a food hub. This is a really great map of the Indian trails that came into Grand Rapids prior to white settlement and during early white settlement. There's a great little video of Tribal Council Chairman Ron Yob of the Grand River Bands of Ottawa Indians that he did for the Grand Rapids Public Museum. If you have a chance to check it out, he really explains how these trails became the roads, and you can overlay the roads coming into Grand Rapids over these trails. There's a really great map that's at the Michigan MSU library again. It's extremely fascinating to see how long people have been coming to this metropolis, bringing things, and how it's been this hub in West Michigan. The reason why this region has been a hub for so long, one of the main reasons, is because it has a long agricultural history. If you read early history of Grand Rapids, they talk about how the missions were set up to teach the Native Americans how to farm, which was actually, if it wasn't so tragic, it'd be laughable. They already knew how to farm. They'd been farming for a long time, teaching Native people how to grow corn is kind of has a sick irony to it, really. And throughout this region, people had been cultivating corn. They had been really stewards of natural wild plants like cranberries and raspberries. Cranberry Lake is, just north of Grand Rapids. It has a big cranberry marsh on it. There were also people growing manumin, or wild rice. Barb Barton has this great map in her book where all the rice beds were. A lot of them are gone now. And at the same time, there were also, according to archaeological evidence and people talking, things that have been written down, there were orchards all the way down the Grand River, some of them with thousands of trees. And going back to that map, so, north of the river, which white people were calling Canada, because they were like, well, we can't move into there, it's like another country, which it was. If you turn around here, it says Indian country up here. And, history for a long time tended to think of that as empty, but it wasn't empty. It was full of these places that people would come to. They were sedentary. They moved between different towns at different times, depending on the seasons. But there were sedentary people there that were growing corn, that were growing fruit crops, tending wild fruit crops, and also tending rice beds. And if you go a little further, north of Grand Rapids, there used to be a rice lake, right? And it was, that was where wild rice was being grown. And in the 1850s, through federal funding, they drained a lot of these lakes, which became really prime agricultural land. So there was agriculture happening. People knew this. People knew that these people were farmers, and they knew that the land was fertile there and you could grow things. Early Grand Rapids, it was a food hub. The Indian trade, talking about here by Albert Baxter, if you go back and read these documents, with a different perspective, you can see how, the first commodities other than furs out of the city were maple sugar and also berries, huckleberries and cranberries. Women would bring them down in baskets, mokirks they called them, and they would trade for different items. And those barrels would get packed up and they would get sent to New York and Buffalo, Boston, and people there really were interested in buying Michigan cranberries, as this ad from the Albany Journal shows. So Article 13 of the Washington Treaty of 1836 ceded these lands north here, but you couldn't buy any of the land until 1839 because it had to be surveyed. And so if you were up there in that land, you were illegally squatting, unless you were part of a mission or you had permission from the federal government. But as Chapman says in their history, it was not an uncommon thing to see white men and Indians tilling their corn in the same fields. And the Zion's Herald in Boston wrote about this amicable relationship between the Ottawas and the settlers. And this is really a kind of a whitewashing of what was actually happening up there in this region. This guy, John A. Clark, he and his partner, John McDonnell, were actually surveying the region. And this is another one of these great maps from Michigan State. What they found was that white people were actually taking away the houses of native people and squatting to obtain the possession. And those valuable points were places where places where these colonists thought that they could grow wheat, and because wheat was, that was the high dollar item. You grow wheat and you can send that off to the East Coast, and it's a lot less perishable than specialty items like apples and cranberries and what had been sent off earlier. At the same time, there's timber on these lands, and you could timber the land. So a lot of people were looking, for a homestead. And one way you could do it was just by literally going across the river and saying, this is mine, because the federal government says it is, even legally if it was not. So this was happening all around the people here. And a really great example, looking again at this Chapman book, this guy's Zelotes Bemis, settled in Walker Township, 1836. So he was squatting. The land was formerly an Indian cornfield and so productive that the owner was enabled to harvest the first wheat crop grown in the district. So that was kind of the goal, was to be able to be one of the first people up there, get this, quote, virgin land, but it was actually land that had been well tilled through, intercropping, which is the way that native people planted the corn, which really took care of the soil. And so you had this wonderful soil, and they were able to grow wheat up there. And this brings us to the letters that are at the library from Adelia Hills. Adelia Hills was a Hubble, and the Hubbles were a wealthy family in Vermont, in Bennington, Vermont. She was also their family was connected with the Ballards and connected with the Hinsdales, which are important families in Grand Rapids. Ballard started the First Congregational Church, and Hinsdale was one of Ballard's friends back in Bennington, and they pretty much ran that city. They owned woolen mills, they started a seminary, They were friends with William Lord Garrison, the famous abolitionist who lived there for a while. They both became abolitionists. So these are congregational abolitionist people from Vermont. In 1837, basically, Hinsdale lost everything. There was the Great Panic that happened. He was already running in the red, and he was insolvent. And so he decided to move to Michigan, and he decided to move to the Grand River Valley to begin a sawmill so he could start cutting logs and sending them to Chicago. So he came earlier in 1837. He's called the Deacon because he was Deacon Hinsdale. And in the letters that Adelia Hills sent, we find that that is where she first lived. What is really cool about these letters is she talks about the journey they made from where they lived in Troy, Vermont, to Grand Rapids. And this is a really fascinating, it's actually a really valuable piece of history, having this primary document. So her husband Turner left earlier, and he went to Detroit, and the plan was that she was going to meet up with them in Detroit. So they, Adelia and her daughter Caroline and her sons Charles and Hollis left Troy, Vermont on Tuesday, May 1st in 1838, and they made their way to Buffalo a week later, where they stayed in the city hotel. They would have started in Troy, which would have been right about here, made their way down this river here, and then to the head of the Erie Canal. And then they would have taken the Erie Canal to Buffalo, and that took a week, which is amazing, much faster than it would have earlier than that. They bought provisions when they got to Buffalo, bread, eggs, milk for their tea and coffee, and she basically said the sleeping was not great on the Erie Canal, and she, quote, "we was all glad when the last night was over with." So from Buffalo, they took a steamer, and the daughter Caroline started getting sick, and she ended up being sick through most of the trip after that. They all got a little sick on the steamer, and we know that they stopped in Cleveland because she wrote to her mother that her husband left the bureau and barrel of pork there. So we can tell that, these were not poor people, but they were money poor because of the Great Panic. There was not a lot of cash, and she talks a lot about that later in the letters. It was mostly wildcat money, which was pretty much worthless by this point. And so she says, "If I had known it time enough, I could have seen it to myself. We were in Cleveland 3 hours on our passage here, but I knew nothing of it till I got here. Contents of the bureau were valuable to me and the loss irreparable, though I suppose I could live without it. For I find by experiences that people can live without much of anything. It comes rather tough at first, but we can get used to it after a while," which kind of is a great description of the things they gave up. So it wasn't, these were not impoverished frontiers people. That was earlier. These are people that were established in society and looking for a new place to go. Vermont was running out of space, and so you moved your way out west. So the steamer landed in Toledo at 9 on the 11th of May. They found cars ready for them, and they went to Adrian. And Turner was supposed to meet them there, and so this is the rest of the line here through Michigan. But Turner was supposed to meet them in Adrian, but he wasn't there until 8 o'clock because she sent a letter ahead to Detroit letting them know they would not land there. But not finding us, wrote Adelia, he went to the post office there, found a letter from me that I wrote in Troy to him in case he should go to that place first. He left his team at Ypsilanti, took the mail road to Detroit, a distance of 30 miles, got in Detroit Thursday evening, next morning, got my letter, so back he went to Ypsilanti, took his team, and came on to Adrian, 65 miles from Detroit. So he did a lot of walking between Detroit and Ypsilanti, and then went and got his team, and then went and picked them up. They went to Tecumseh. They slept with some old neighbors that they knew from Vermont, and then they left Tecumseh the next day, went to Jackson. Caroline was getting sicker, and they went to Marshall, and then on to Battle Creek. They planned the next day to make it to Grand Rapids, but the weather didn't help. But but they made it the next day. An interesting anecdote about her, and really showing her class position is in Jackson, she was in they stopped at a place that was in, quote, intolerable dirty, and they just couldn't stay there. But there were other log cabins she would stop in that said it was wonderful. So they made it to Grand Rapids, and they stayed with Deacon Stephen Hinsdale. Well, I'd love to keep talking about Adelia Hills, and there's a lot of great stuff in these letters. I got 150 years to go now in the next 10 or 15 minutes. She is a transition, though, and one of the most important transitions up there is from the time people like her settled to when they established commercial agriculture. And it's a really great juxtaposition to look at one of the early letters she wrote compared to one of the later letters. And one of the early letters here comes from a year after they got there, and she was really fed up with people in log cabins. She did not like the squatters around her. She, at the same time, they all got sick. They all had ague. They were going to leave at one time. He actually dies in a few years later because it pretty much it wears Turner out. Turner ended up walking to Ionia to buy land. They eventually did buy land, and that on the right there, her son built that barn and that farmhouse right there, and which was right about where Tractor Supply is now on M37. If you go up Alpine there. But what she writes here, Michigan will always be Michigan. I grow more disgusted the more I see of it. I should give up the ship. If I did not indulge a hope that I shall get away, I don't care where I go, to Ohio or York State, anywhere on the face of creation but Michigan, which is what I titled this, because I really see the transition happening here of this is a horrible place. And then 2 decades later she writes, Michigan is a great place for frolicking, or just around where we live is, and talking about her sister. I should like to leave her come in the fall. Michigan is more pleasant at that season than any other. And really, by this period, by the 1850s, they had, this barn wasn't built quite yet, I don't think. It might have been, actually. Actually, it was. It says in the letters. And they already had, 40 peach trees, and they were sitting on, by this time, they had 40 acres, and if I'm not mistaken, they had 80 by this time. And her and her son, her other son went to Muskegon to be a lumber person, but her and her son ended up being more growing row crops and raising dairy cattle. But they still did some fruit, and they said they would buy fruit from their neighbors. And this region became really important for fruit production by the 1870s. 20 years later, you had farms that looked like this. I mean, they were still mixed farms, but those are fairly large, orchards back there. If you look at the censuses from that period, there's people with some big orchards, 100 trees, 150 trees, a few acres, and so this is when the Fruit Ridge actually becomes a place where people have figured out, through the original cultural exchange between Native people and white people, which was one way, obviously, and then through experimentation, and they were also hooked up with the Michigan Agricultural College and other horticulturalists and people like that. They started developing the ridge in the 1870s, and people started coming. By the 1850s on, a lot of the families up there with, or at least some of them with Centennial Farms, their families came in the 1850s. And they came up to grow wheat, if you talk to a lot of people, but at the same time they always had orchards for home consumption. And then eventually with the market in Grand Rapids, which I'll talk about in a second, they had a place to unload their apples. One of the most interesting families that I really would like to dig into more, I don't have a lot of time here, and I really haven't found a lot about them yet, are the Vaughns. This guy, William Vaughn, and his brother John Vaughn, they're credited with being the first people in Kent City, and they are freeborn black people from Vermont, and they tend to fall out of the historical record when people talk about how they grew, or they had a log cabin in Kent City, which eventually which became the hotel in Kent City, and they kind of disappear from the historical record. But in this 1876 atlas here, you see that this is William Vaughn, and he has a well-developed farm here. And he was looking at the census. He lived next door to the Sowers, who are ancestors of the people that started Old Orchard. And you can see that he has a nice orchard back in here. He also has a vegetable garden, a good-sized vegetable garden. And this is located right now just north of 14 Mile on Peach Ridge Road. And they were the only black family really in Sparta for quite some time. And this is where they lived, right here, about on 14 Mile and Peach Ridge. So this property right here. And this is actually remnants of their barn right here. This is where the foundation was. And as far as I can tell, this is where their house was right here. That picture from the atlas is right about right here. So it'd be really great to really investigate this family a bit more. And hopefully someone does. But needless to say, those Yankee settlers that came in, they really started something, right? And when they started this commercial space, people started coming in. And there's important reasons why people felt like they could come here and grow fruit. And I'm not going to get too deep. I don't really have time to really dig into these guys, but there were horticulturalists in the area, even back into the Civil War period. This guy, Henry Clubb, was from Grand Haven, and he drew this map. He was actually the head of the American Vegetarians Association, the most popular vegetarian probably in the United States, and he lived in Grand Haven, and he made this Peach Belt map. And you have the Michigan Agricultural College and other development. And I don't want to get too deep into that, but there was this map made too about the Kent Peach Belt back in 1902. So people were really interested in the space to be able to grow fruits, and at the same time they were really marketing it. So the Ridge, like I said before, is a place that it was marketed as a space, as a place right outside of Grand Rapids. And this started initially when thinking about marketplaces in Grand Rapids. Fruit people tended to get prime spots when there was a city market downtown. This is one that was there before they put the one on the island, and it says here war declared because the Grand Rapids Fruit Growers Association actually got the best spots on the market, and vegetable farmers from over by Holland would come on the market and have to be in their own special place. So this is about this guy Harley Strong, who said, I'm not going to move my stuff, and the police actually came and moved him off. So they had local politics on their side. When the market was built, when the Grand Rapids wholesale market was built, it became considered the largest wholesale market in the world. Whether that's hyperbole or not, it was obviously a really big place. Like 7 acres. It was on the island, and 1 million bushels of peaches would come in every year through this place. And you would have people like from like 1912 here, the Coulters, they came down from on the ridge, and it seems like everybody has a story of their great grandpa getting in a wagon and falling asleep, and the horses taking them down to the wholesale market. And this guy Coulter, this article here is about how he had a light, a acetylene light, actually on the front of his wagon that you can see right there. And all of the people up on the ridge would follow him down to the Grand Rapids wholesale market and sell their peaches. And these peaches would end up either they'd go to wholesale merchants, they'd either be sold in town, they may end up on a train that would move quickly down to Chicago. And so going really a lot of time here, but this is the really big organization that turned the Ridge into what we think of it as now. And these guys, a handful of farmers, Clink and a few other people, they created this Peach Ridge Growers Association. And the way it was done is it was started by them putting a classified ad in the paper. They weren't moving their peaches like they would like. They had a bumper crop, and the Flint Daily Journal and a couple other big Detroit papers, and even in Ohio they put stuff in there, and they ran this ad, and drive to the Peach Ridge section, it says, from 8 miles west of Rockford to Big Springs, and the South Havens will be ripe, and they were. The South Haven developed down in South Haven, just like on the ridge, the Ida Red was developed. More important things that happened there, and we end up with this Peach Growers Association, and they're cooperatively marketing. You add on with this cold storage. They've one of the biggest innovators of cold storage in the country was this guy Henry Kraft. In the teens, he built a cold storage building, lined it with tile, right, and really was the prototype where the extension agents were, actually he was found one day when extension agents were driving through, and they're like, "What is that?" And that's Henry Kraft's cold storage. Once you can store, right, then you can speculate, and then you're no longer at the mercy of the market, which was a really important development when it came to growing apples. Peaches, obviously, was where the name came from, but in Kent County and Ottawa and this little section here, people grew peaches in between the apples, and then they slowly pulled them out, which was really a boon, because in Southwest Michigan they had big peach orchards. Excuse me. And when the yellows came through, there was no longer it decimated the crops, and that's about when Georgia became the peach growing place. But one of the most important things was the apple smorgasbord. And the apple smorgasbord was where this Peach Ridge Growers Association decided to have an event where the wives would have their best recipes come, and then they would invite people from all over the state. And it was really a genius way to market the Ridge. Every year you had the Apple Queen, and this is Sally Nyblad here, the Apple Queen. This is from the Michigan State Archives. There's some really great pictures. They would make apple butter over a cauldron. But what was most important about this is it was political. So this picture down here shows Gerald Ford coming in. Gerald Ford is a representative here in 1954, coming in for the smorgasbord. When he became president, they would ask him to come, and it was an opportunity for him for the Peach Growers Association it was a lobby. They had the ear of Gerald Ford, and when he became president, and in his notes, and as a representative also, they show up in a lot of that, in a lot of the his notes. And one of the ones I found from the mid-'70s talks about they were prepping him about a law that had to do with workers and pesticides, and the farmers felt that it was unfair that they were already following the regulations that they should to protect their workers, and the federal government was saying no, and Gerald Ford was called upon to give a talk at the smorgasbord about this. And this brings up something really important that I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about: the labor. And the other major component to growing fruit is it's a labor-intensive process, and there is always that push back and forth between the protection of workers who are invariably from marginalized communities, usually racially, and the bottom line of farmers. And so this is something on the Ridge that is still a problem, and still something that is important to think about. And historically, this is something that, with the Ridge, that needs to be included as part of the history of the Ridge. And finally, the current story of the Ridge is really overproduction. These really large orchards are producing a lot of apples, and which is driving prices down along with competition from outside. And the future is not really certain. Yet there's a lot of people innovating up there. One of the most interesting ones is Schaefer Orchards with puck cider. They're taking advantage of that surplus of apple juice or cider, and at the same time, they have a beautiful heritage orchard where they're mixing it together for some wonderful hard cider. And also, the long legacy of growing fruit on the Grand River is being remembered through the Grand River Band of Ottawa Indians, who have planted plum trees where settlers had burned one of their orchards for agriculture. And this reminds me of something that was said to me by someone up on the ridge when I asked them about the history of Grand Rapids and furniture. And what they said was, furniture's gone, but we're still here. So thank you.